Hello, everyone. It's a beautiful day in the Redwoods, and today I'm going to read to you the opening to my short story, The Fallen Man. The Fallen Man. The light was almost perfect. In a few minutes, a quarter of an hour perhaps, the sun would pass behind the gossamer clouds, just barely substantial enough to scatter the slanting morning sun. Radiance would fill the valley, touching the pale leaves of the olive groves with silver fire. And there, beyond the expanse of orchard and the narrow tilled fields, past the village and its tiled roofs, the color of dried blood, there, on its promontory of rock, defiant of prince and heaven, rose the citadel of Castiglione. Rodiana Onorato squinted at the sun, judging the infinitesimal shift in its spectrum. She'd arrived with ample time to ready her board and easel and set out her willow stick charcoal and chalk of red ochre, but the cloud cover was not yet right for the effect she desired. There was no help for it. The skies would do as they willed, and certainly not in obedience to a journeyman painter such as herself, no matter how noble her first patronage. With a deft, quick touch, she began to sketch the scene before her. She would add detail and more color later, and if she were fortunate or perhaps imaginative, she'd be able to capture that subtle intimation of shapes in cloud and light, the figures as much suggested as depicted. The master painter with whom she'd studied until last year had described how such half-glimpsed elements might play on the mind of the beholder. Some evoked a sense of peace, others a formless dread. The air cooled slightly. She glanced up. Haze, so thin as to be almost invisible, diffused the sun's harshness. The glare of the day softened. Colors muted, and yet glowed subtly as if their inner hues were slowly being revealed. The tip of her charcoal flew across the paper, tracing the gathering clouds. A wind sprang up. Tendrils of her hair pulled free from her head kerchief and stirred against her cheek. The outlines of the scene before her were almost complete. Village, trees, knob of angry fractured rock. The palace, with its walls and towers, its narrow mullioned windows. A shiver passed through her. She looked up again, her attention momentarily distracted by the freshening wind. The clouds were no longer a filmy gauze covering half the sky. They had rushed together like rumpled foam, huge clumps and waves piled upon themselves. Behind them, the sun ignited the edges, nigh as blinding as the naked globe. Even that brief exposure sent her eyes watering and cast a pall over her vision. Quickly, she looked away. Several minutes passed before her sight was hers, and she dared to glance up again. The rim of fire had dulled, and a rapture of darkness now coalesced in the heart of the clouds. Her hands stilled in her lap. Her mind wandered, shaping the billows into fanciful designs, as her childhood self had loved to do. A panther, a rearing bull, perhaps there, the black swan that was the heraldic symbol of the Duke of Castiglione. And what a swan it was, huge and noble, with its proud arched neck, the powerful wings spread wide, the head turned as if poised to strike. The swan's eyes glinted silver. Rodiana blinked and looked again. This time no bits of eldritch brightness beckoned her from above. It had been a trick of the light and the gathering clouds, nothing more. The wings stretched wide and wider. She clambered to her feet, all disbelief dissolving. The swan turned and she saw it was not a creature of feathers, but of rain and unspent thunder. Lightning lit its eyes that held her as a captive in its regard. It drew back, feather tips fluttering, reaching. In her mind, she saw it wheeling, hovering over the approach to the palace. Its cry filled her skull. Her hands moved of their own accord, using line and shading to capture the image. Her charcoal moved in swooping, generous lines, making the shadows denser and the gleam of sun on feathers even brighter. The swan loomed over the distant palace, now even larger than when she glimpsed it. Working faster, racing to finish before the storm broke, she textured in the boundary between feathers and sky. When she glanced up, however, the bird was gone. The gathering billows, bellied with rain, had become ordinary clouds, nothing more. Yet the storm swan remained on her paper, fixed in mid-flight. The first heavy drops spattered the ground. Night had fallen, and Rodiana was thoroughly soaked by the time she trudged through the servants' gate of the palace. The downpour, swift and hard, had caught her in the open, and she'd been forced more than once to shelter in the groves. Her old master had trained her to wrap her drawings in oilskin, regardless of the weather, or they would surely have been ruined. As it was, her drawing of the storm swan was damp around the edges, although luckily not worse. By all the blessings of the saints, the storm had not entirely driven off the day's warmth, or she would have been bone-chilled as well. She had no personal servant, not being able to afford one of her own, or having sufficient stature to warrant being assigned one of the palaces. Unlike the household servants, she had a chamber all of her own, and some thoughtful maid had seen to the lighting her fire and providing several lengths of coarse toweling. A plate with a wedge of cheese, some dates, and a chunk of bread had been set out. She changed into her single indoor dress, a plain undyed chemise and overdress, then dried her hair and combed it out as best she could. At last she made herself presentable. The Duke might be indulgent in many ways, but he expected to be able to show off his resident artisan at his convenience, not hers. With a final pat of her still damp curls, Rodiana gathered up her sketchbook and charcoal sticks and made her way to the Hall of Artistic Elegance. At least that's what the last resident painter hired by the Duke's grandfather had named it. Privately, she called it the Hall of Horrors for the hideous imbalance of hues, complicated by the poor preparation of the pigments. Of the many faults in perspective and the anatomy of the figures depicted in the painted wooden panels, the less said, the better. Rodiana's duties included not only replacing those paintings with fresh new scenes, especially those depicting the present Duke in heroic poses, but also sketching informal portraits for his guests. She slipped into the garishly decorated chamber, filled with richly dressed men and women, the air thick with scents of rose water and cloves, and began her circuit of the periphery. She wanted a sense of the gathering before approaching any of the guests. Soon she recognized as regular attenders at such festivities minor aristocrats from neighboring estates, a few wealthy traders with daughters of eligible age, even the Duke's personal confessore. She knew the resident musicians as well, for they often ate together in the kitchen. They were a fairly decent lot, fond of laughter, but either married or not interested in women. She did not see the Duke, but that was not unusual, for he liked to make a grand entrance. The Duke's maggiordomo caught her gaze and indicated with a jerk of his head that she should get to her work. Lifting her chin, she turned her back on him and walked up to the nearest guest, a girl whose skin was rendered sallow by her elaborate gown of giallo brocade. Rodiana curtsied to the girl's father and introduced herself, offering an informal sketch. When the father hesitated, she explained that the Duke had engaged her services as an amusement, and that in general her subjects were pleased. The girl's expression shifted from embarrassment to curiosity. Accustomed to working while bracing the board on which her paper was tacked against her hip, Rhodiana began drawing, first establishing the shape of the girl's head and shoulders with a few quick strokes. As she began to add detail, the lines of cheekbone and nose, a bit of neckline, the father circled around to watch over her shoulder. "Please, Sarah," she murmured, "if my focus is interrupted, I will not be able to do full justice to my subject." "Does his grace not observe when you draw?" "No, Sarah." Most peculiar." But he withdrew, rather than be seen to criticize his host and liege. Rhodiana focused her attention on the sketch, adding shading. The girl's eyes were darker than she'd first thought. The room receded, blurring. Behind the girl's shoulders, forms suggested themselves. A wood, perhaps, the bole of a tree, but none such as grew here. Something wilder, hinting of a forest. A sinuous figure stretched out a paw that ended in the suggestion of long, hooked claws. Rhodiana could barely hear the music now or the chatter of the crowd. She had ventured too far into her artistic trance. It wasn't safe, not with this strange distortion of vision revealing the predator. She tried to shake herself free, but there was no way to unsee the panther, circling closer now, menacing the girl or she herself. Swan wings, swan wings. The images rose up to suffocate her. Swan wings on paper, panther limbed in charcoal. She came back to herself with a start. To her right, a lady in cream pale satin forced a high artificial laugh. The musicians played the final cadence of a dance. She stared at the girl before her and then the paper on her board. A smudge or two with her fingertips rendered the great cat into a blur, the suggestion of movement in the background, nothing more. Keeping the sketch to finish later, Rhodiana wandered off in search of her next subject. What had happened? Was the panther, like the swan she'd seen earlier, a fanciful notion born of her imagination? Or were they real creatures, not quite of flesh, but of spirit? Despite the press of bodies, the room turned chill. So that's the opening. And if you want to know what happens next, I promise you both the swan and the panther will come into play. And it's available for pre-order, or you can wait until July 1st. Thank you so much for listening, and enjoy this beautiful summer day.